Alexander, thanks for coming on. I really appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
My name's Alexander Waugh. I'm a writer. Well, most of my life I've been writing. I've written a number of books, one called The House of Wittgenstein, quite famous in America, one called Fathers and Sons. The Wittgenstein one was about the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein. I've been a music critic for quite a lot of my life. And I think the reason you've invited me to speak with you is because of my expertise on Shakespeare, and most particularly on the Shakespeare authorship question. I've been working on that for the best part of 15 years. I did a little book called Shakespeare in Court, which you can buy on Amazon. I've also just finished with a scholar called Roger Strittmatter, a 2-volume work which looks into every single time the name Shakespeare was mentioned by his contemporaries. And if you look very carefully at those mentions of Shakespeare, you discover that everybody was perfectly aware at the time that it was a pseudonym. So that's been a lot of my work recently. I also compose music. I write little plays and generally mix about in the world of letters and historical literary scholarship.
Cool. What was your work on Wittgenstein? What was that book about?
So it was a book called The House of Wittgenstein, A Family at War. And it was about, really principally about the brother called Paul Wittgenstein, who found himself at the very beginning of the First World War. This is a Viennese family, with his arm being amputated in a Russian hospital. He was taken prisoner by the Russians, and he determined himself to become a great pianist, even though he only had one hand. And he was the brother of, as I say, of the great philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein, who was his younger brother, and his 3 older brothers had all committed suicide. And Paul Wittgenstein went on to become a considerable pianist of the left hand, and had concertos written for him by Maurice Ravel and Sergei Prokofiev, and famous composers like that. Richard Strauss wrote 2 concertos for him. That's what it's about.
Cool. I'm familiar with Ludwig Wittgenstein. I've done quite a bit of studying on his linguistic arguments and his attack on philosophy. It's quite interesting.
Yeah, not always easy to understand. And Ludwig himself often couldn't understand what he was saying, and often had very clever people with him, and they went line by line through his writings and ended up with both Ludwig and the philosopher who was trying to understand it in total misery of misapprehension and misunderstanding. So I don't blame you if you didn't quite get it.
So tell me more about Shakespeare, because this topic interests me for a number of reasons, specifically because there's a parallel argument from Jesus mythicists who think Jesus didn't exist. And so I'm really interested in establishing the methodology of how we come to believe that one particular person in the past did or didn't exist based on testimony. And so I'd like definitely to hear first, like, what is the methodology you use to establish that a person from a historical account did or didn't exist? What do we need to see to conclude they did versus what we need to see to conclude it's just a fabrication?
Yes. So first of all, let's be absolutely clear. I'm never saying that William Shakespeare didn't exist. We have all those plays to prove that someone, or at least a group of people, were out there writing those plays. What the Shakespeare authorship question asks is William Shakespeare a pseudonym? And I answer with an emphatic yes. And what you call the methodology, which I would probably just call the evidence to support that, lies in a great many different places and a great many different types of evidence. As I just mentioned to you briefly, the evidence of contemporaries talking about William Shakespeare is very important indeed. And if you go to a modern English literature academic, because it is the English literature academics who jealously guard the flame, claiming that William Shakespeare of Stratford was the author of these works. If you go to these English literature academics and say to them, look here, why is it that every single time a contemporary talks of William Shakespeare, they talk about him in an extraordinarily recondite, complicated, mischievous, secretive way, they throw up their hands in despair and say, I can't quite understand. If you know that William Shakespeare is a pseudonym, then you can look at all those references and see very, very clearly what's going on. And they're all going nod, nod, wink, wink, tap the nose. We all know exactly that William Shakespeare was a pseudonym, and we all know who he was. So once you free yourself of the inability to accept that William Shakespeare is a pseudonym, then everything quite quickly falls into place, and the evidence stands before you relatively easy to find. I mean, you're not going to find a straight out and out sentence saying William Shakespeare was a pseudonym and I knew him and his real name was Edward de Vere and his fellow playwrights who were all writing under that name. I don't think that will ever be found. But we have enough evidence, about 170 different pieces of evidence, hinting very heavily at that being the case.
Such as, like, what are the things that indicate that this was a pseudonym for someone else and not the Shakespeare of what was the city, I believe, Stratford.
Yes. So the general belief is the foolish belief. It hasn't been properly investigated, and it hasn't been investigated because people block their ears and eyes and noses and throats to certain evidence because they're emotionally attached to the idea of William Shakespeare of Stratford. Now, there was a real man called William Shakespeare of Stratford. In fact, there were about 8 people called William Shakespeare or Shakespeare around at the time. But the one who's been artificially fathered, or is said to have fathered the plays, was William Shakespeare of Stratford upon Avon, this town in the Midlands. Now, what do we know about him? We know about 70 facts, contemporary facts, and not one of those points to his being a writer during his lifetime or a poet of any sort. We know, for instance, that he lent some money to a certain person and was a bit unpleasant when it wasn't paid back quickly enough. We know that he had twins and he had a daughter, and when they were born, we know when he was buried, when he died, and various points that show him up really to be a businessman, a man with a bit of agricultural holding, but never a writer. And this is utterly peculiar because if you look at other great writers of the time, you know, Ben Jonson, Michael Drayton, Robert Greene, one can go through a whole list of them, and you can find documentation that says this man was a poet, and you can find it on simple things like little bills. Ben Jonson, the poet, is owing so much money to someone else. But there is no contemporary evidence of any sort that William Shakespeare of Stratford was a writer, let alone the greatest writer ever in the history of the universe. So this causes a certain amount of dismay to those who would love to write biographies of him. I'm sorry. And he has an interesting point, is that nobody wrote a biography of Shakespeare, not a book-length biography, until 1852. And that's rather peculiar if you think about it. And the reason they didn't is they couldn't find anything about him at all. And 4 years later, a woman called Delia Bacon, completed the first book-length biography of Shakespeare, saying that actually it was a pseudonym. So the arguments about it being a pseudonym or being the real name of a writer called William Shakespeare of Stratford are more or less contemporary, and they started really in 1852 or 1850s and have been going pretty well ever since. You might say, well, there's not much more to add, is there? What more can you add? But huge amounts have been added. I mean, in the last 4 or 5 years, we've learned so much more now about this whole matter that it has been really moved beyond all dispute. Now, I say beyond dispute. That is because I'm putting out huge amounts of evidence and I'm not finding many people disputing me. I find people abusing me. I find people running for cover with their ears blocked. But I don't find any constructive criticism of the evidence that has been unveiled in the last 5 years. Sorry, that was a bit of a wandering answer. If you wish to pin me down a bit more on things, then I'll try and answer a bit more.
Well, didn't William Shakespeare have an autobiography? I thought he was revealed as William Shakespeare's in his autobiography.
A biography, sorry. I accidentally said autobiography. I mean,
right. So I thought he did have an autobiography, and you're claiming he did not.
Yeah, I mean, I would like to point this out, that the plays themselves are hugely autobiographical. And that's one way. I mean, it's not a very conclusive way, but it's a fascinating way that we can pin these plays on one particular person, a person who, as King Lear, had 3 daughters and divided his kingdom or his ancient patrimony by those 3 daughters, a person who, like Othello, was in Venice when he was told that his wife had betrayed him, and he got absolutely furious about it and treated his wife very badly. A person who, from his generosity as a patron, went completely bankrupt, just as Timon of Athens does in that play. A person who is outraged that his wife has produced a child that is not his, just as we know happened in A Winter's Tale. And I could go on and on and on. These plays are highly autobiographical, and particularly, actually, almost more than all of them is the play Hamlet.
So one of the things is there's the Francis Maurice in 1598 named Shakespeare as the playwright and poet in his Palladis Tamia, and which included many different things that were initially published anonymously. So if it was a pseudonym, it would seem counterproductive for Shakespeare to publish something anonymously for any purpose, because he's already had a pseudonym. And so why would someone using the pseudonym of Shakespeare publish something anonymously without just using a pseudonym?
I think that things were published anonymously before the pseudonym was applied to any plays. After a while, they all appeared with the name William Shakespeare on them. You mention Francis Mears in Palladis Tamia. He simply says that Shakespeare wrote the following plays, just as I might say that George Orwell wrote the following books. And I'm not having in every single sentence to say, oh, by the way, George Orwell was a pseudonym. You don't have to say that. Francis Mears actually was extremely clever, and he was a numerologist, and he sets up that little list of names in such a way as to show that William Shakespeare was a pseudonym. And I've actually put that online. It's a little bit complicated to explain without visuals, but if anybody's interested, I've put a little program up on YouTube called Francis Mears Knew, and I go through very carefully about Francis Mears and show exactly how you know that he knew who William Shakespeare really was, who was the person behind that pseudonym.
Could it not just be a coincidence? Because I know that people who do lots of numerology arguments happens just to be coincidence. I know that there's a argument for Vlad Penning, I believe, who did his numerology in the Bible, and someone said, "Oh, it's so perfect, it can't be replicated." And he bet me $1,000 I couldn't replicate it, and I did it in 3 days. And so I'm not confident in numerology arguments, because I think you can find numerological patterns in pretty much anything if you look hard enough. So could that just be a coincidence, and really he really just was Shakespeare? And of the 2 hypotheses, why would one be preferred over the other?
Yes, I didn't say that Francis Mears's solution was a numerological solution. I said that Francis Mears was a numerologist. That's a slightly different thing. He wrote a book about numbers and God, which just preceded the one that you're talking about, called Palladis Tamia. As a matter of fact, it doesn't really use numbers, that particular example, to show that Shakespeare was a pseudonym. What he does is he compares a set of the Greek and Latin writers to a set of English writers. And this is part of a large number of paragraphs which do exactly the same thing. As such and such and such and such and so did something, so did these English ones, so and so and so and so. And all you really have to do is to line the 2 lists up and find that all of them correspond. So in other words, all of the Greek and Latin writers correspond precisely to an English writer on the other side, either because they wrote poems about the same subject or for other reasons. And Shakespeare aligns up to Aristonymus, which means aristocratic name. And then through another little trick, he lets you know which aristocratic name is the one that is missing, because it's also in that same paragraph. So it's not really numerology precisely. Numerology is a bit more the study of numbers and their specific divine meanings. That numerology comes out of the ancient idea that God created the universe and everything in it using letters and numbers, and that letters are equivalents to numbers, and therefore you can divine meaning through letters that are attached to numbers and vice versa. So that's not quite what Mears was doing, though I appreciate your concern about numerology, and there's no reason one shouldn't be concerned with it. However, I would say that when something has been encrypted properly and sensibly, and in those days, it was always done brilliantly, and it's done in such a way that you really can't knock it down. And what we found, particularly with the Baconians, there was a whole lot of people who believed that Francis Bacon was Shakespeare, and they came up with the most absurd ideas, and trawling through the whole of Shakespeare's works, using numerology, using anagrams anywhere where they thought they could get away with it, and saying, oh look, this is an anagram of Bacon, and therefore Bacon wrote the plays. I'm talking about encryptions of a completely different order of sense and magnitude of these that are protected usually by a system of 3 times 3. So in other words, everything that is stated is 3 times corroborated. Bit complicated to explain, but as I say, this only happens twice, I would think, in 170 different contemporary allusions to Shakespeare. So it's not as though I'm pinning my whole argument on that kind of decipherment.
Yeah. So what exactly is encrypted? Where are you getting the encryption from? Is it just patterns in letters in his writing somewhere, or like is there actually some kind of a cipher somewhere that you can has some hidden message?
As I say, I'm not deep into encryptions, but I have decrypted one thing that is utterly spectacular, and that is the dedication to the sonnets of 1609. And long before I came along and fiddled about with it and worked out exactly what it was doing, people were saying this must be encrypted. And the reason they say it must be encrypted is, you could look at this and in 5 seconds say there's something weird about it. First of all, the English doesn't make sense. It's set into words in 3 triangles, upside down triangles, and there's a conspicuous dot between every single word, and there are dots and hyphens. And well, I could get it for you. I might know it by heart, I might not. To the only begetter of these ensuing sonnets, Mr. W.H., all happiness and that eternity promised by our ever-living poet wisheth the well-wisheth adventurer in setting forth. I mean, already that's hardly English. Now you look at it and you see how it's capitalized and set into 3 triangles. I'm talking about this 3 times 3. And what I found in it is more spectacular than any single bit of de-encryption I think that I've ever come across. And you've got to remember that cryptology now is mainly to do with computers, but cryptology then, before you had computers, was to do very often with the written word and different ways of concealing messages within the written word. And all I can tell you is that little bit of what sounds like prose that I just said by heart to you, it didn't make a lot of sense. When you unravel it, it tells you not only who Shakespeare was, which most people have already guessed anyway, it tells you which city he is buried in. It tells you which part of that city, which church within that city, which part of the church within that city. And you only have to flip the front page and it tells you the exact spot within the part of that church within that city where he's buried. Not only that, it actually tells you what the first 18 sonnets at very least are all about. And all of that is encrypted in that little thing I just read out to you. So it is highly spectacular when you get to it. And if I were to die tomorrow and on my deathbed and anyone said to me, well, what have you achieved in your life? I'll say, well, I think, with all honesty, the greatest achievement of my life was to decrypt that and to discover that the real Shakespeare was buried, guess where? Smack underneath the monument to William Shakespeare that was placed there in Westminster Abbey in 1740. And when I discovered that, I tell you, it was just the most extraordinary thing to discover. And as I say, no one has been able to knock it. And I think
Well,
I've had
quick
about
question: have you had it
1,000
checked by?
views on.
Well, have you had it checked by a cryptographer? Because I know there's people who are
Well,
actually.
I've had mathematicians look over it, and it always gets so silly at that point. You know, we're talking about so the question to ask the mathematician is, what are the odds of this thing being here unintentionally? It's not a very good question, and you get a very, very stupid answer, which is 0.00076 times 10 to the minus 13. Well, I mean, that's such a remote chance it may as well be zero, but it doesn't impress me. You really have to see the thing itself to understand that how it works and how it appeals to the common sense of any intelligent person, to see that it is completely bulletproof. Now, if any of your listeners or whatever are interested in that, I've put up a video online called The Incalculable Genius of John Dee. And in that, I just go through it in a quite easy and light way. And you can see how it works. And I will defy you or any of your viewers to give me a sensible reason why that isn't really 100% a strong case. But
Well,
as I say, you know, decrypting is not the major part of my work. I just happen to be very proud of that because it was incredible. And I leant on the shoulders of others who had kind of started and wriggled around with this thing and saw there was something very odd about it. I mean, there was a man called Alan Green who about 6 or 7 years ago discovered some extraordinary geometry that was hidden on the title page of the sonnets. This is the same thing that I was talking about, the dedication of the 1609 sonnets. And he didn't really know what that geometry was, but there it was, and it was completely irrefutable, and it was mathematically there, and it consisted of 4 right-angled triangles making up a perfect circle with a diameter shed between all of them, and that was there on the sonnet's title page, and that really was utterly irrefutable. Nobody can say it's not there because it just is, and he got it just by joining dots and line ends that are pretty kind of obvious when you look at the page. They're things, not mad things like the middle of a letter S or something. It's a specific dots and line ends on the page, and there's that hidden geometry. Again, it's you can't argue with it. Now, what bearing does that have on the authorship? Well, it does have a bearing, because if you come down from the P of Shakespeare's, it goes straight through the center of this extraordinary circle that was discovered and forms a Chi-Rho symbol of Christ, not someone I know you approve of necessarily. That's not the point. And that symbol of Christ points at its 4 corners to the name of Shakespeare, the real name of Shakespeare. It says, by God and this man's name. And that, again, you're dealing with pure geometry there. It just looks a bit babyish when people sit around saying, oh, well, it could be a coincidence. I mean, really, you have to look at it to understand why it couldn't.
Well, that's why I brought up the cryptographer, because mathematicians are the wrong people to look at this kind of information.
Yes.
There's many things like in Moby Dick, I believe it was Moby Dick, where they predicted the death of Kennedy, the death of Lincoln, the assassinations of some authorities in India, different politicians. And the probability of this is equally incredibly low, given some kind of mathematical function. But what we want is to have a cryptographer look at it and say, is this pattern something that's an intentional thing done by the author, or is it a random just coincidence? And cryptographers have very good educated methodologies to distinguish that. And so I would be interested to have a professional cryptographer look at the document and see if your cipher is confirmed to be a genuine solution to the cipher, as opposed to it just being a happenstance solution. The same thing.
I would be delighted for that. And then if you knew a good cryptographer, I'd be more than pleased. There were 2 cryptographers called Friedman and Friedman who wrote a book about cryptography and set out a number of rules about how an encryption has to work, including a key to it. It has to have a key. It has to have a reason why it's there. It can't produce any other solutions. I can't remember off the top of my head all of the rules, but there are about 6 or 7 rules. And the thing I'm talking about absolutely fits every single one of those rules perfectly. But that book was published, I think, in 1957, the Freedman's book. And so what I haven't been able to do is find a modern cryptographer who isn't completely immersed um, in in computer cryptography and would take an interest in this. But if you or any of your listeners knew a cryptographer or knew of one, I would be absolutely over the moon to have it properly looked at by a cryptographer. And
Well, I
I
know
have,
there's about a dozen who worked on the mass murderer Zodiac killer, the Zodiac killer ciphers, and there's a large group of people who work on those kinds of ciphers and are professionals at it. So if you could have one of them look at your document and confirm
yeah,
it and publish that in the paper, that would be considerable evidence to try to move towards your conclusion for sure.
I would be delighted. I mean, look, I've put these things out on YouTube. That channel has had over 900,000 views now. I did actually send some of this work to professor very recently, and I've forgotten his name now, but he did a course at the Warburg Institute on cryptography, and I said, would he include some of this stuff and look it over? And unsurprisingly, and he was interested in the period that I'm interested in sort of John Dee in the 16th and 17th centuries. But he's also what we call a Stratfordianist, which is an emotional type of person who does not like to be budged off his little rock, saying that Shakespeare was a pseudonym. So I haven't heard back from him, and I think this is a great problem. I knew a number of people who actually went on his course that he did with the Warburg Institute and brought up my ciphers, but he hasn't yet, as far as I'm aware, examined them. And I think partly that's an emotional reason, because the Shakespeare authorship question, for some people, for me, it's a question of evidence, but for other people, it is a question of pure red hot emotion, of political warfare, and other sentimental reasons that people just do not want to acknowledge this as a major problem.
Well, yeah, because I can understand that given it looks like there's lots of evidence he's a real person. So, for example, uh, William Shakespeare was entitled with the honorific of master after his father's death. And at the same time, the author was starting to get the same title applied to his works, referenced from contemporaries in the time period. So it seems like if it was a pseudonym, it wouldn't make sense that a person who was given this title would then also start to see the title being applied to the pseudonym. And so it seems like it would make sense that it was a real person, given that he was titled and that the pseudonym was also given the title.
Yes, you mustn't confuse master with a title. It's not a title. It just means anything from master of a craft or master of a household. And you'll find that most writers, painters, lots of people call master. It could also mean a master of the arts at one of the two universities. You'd be called master if you had what we now call an MA. So it's not a title. And there's no reason whatsoever that if there isn't a famous playwright going around called William Bloggins, whether it's a pseudonym or whether it's an actual name, that people wouldn't say Master William Bloggins, because he is indeed a great master of writing and a master poet. So I don't think that at all helps William Shakespeare of Stratford, who, by all evidence, couldn't probably write his name. And it really is that bad. Some people try to be kinder and say, well, maybe he could write his name, but he was functionally illiterate. What we have, so-called from his hand, are 6 signatures, but they're all spelt very differently. Some of them are on the seal ribbon of legal documents where you're not supposed to sign your name at all. And what you would simply put is a clerk who could write would attest whose seal it was, or who was the person involved in the legal document, by writing it on the seal ribbon. That's the ribbon that connects the seal to the actual legal document. Now, we have another document of William Shakespeare where it's written Shak P. Again, it was illegal, if you could write your name and sign it, to write an abbreviated version of your name. And underneath that Shak P, it's known as the Belloc Mountjoy document, there's a very large round blob. And I'm very sorry to say this, but if anyone looking at this dispassionately would assume, as was quite normal in those days, that that round blob was William Shakespeare of Stratford's mark, because he was a marksman means he couldn't actually write. He couldn't actually sign his name. So he put a blob, and a clerk wrote Will Shakespeare above it. That is the evidence pointing there. Now, we also know that William Shakespeare was probably the greatest writer in the world, who wrote, for instance, The Tempest, in which he boasts, Prospero boasts of the great pride he takes in educating his daughter, Miranda. William Shakespeare of Stratford's father and mother could not write. His father was a marksman and signed his name with an X. His daughter, Judith, signed her name with something that looks a bit like a pigtail. It's a mark. And his other daughter, Susanna, couldn't recognize her husband, who was called John Hall, was a doctor, couldn't recognize his handwriting. So it looks very much like neither of his daughters could write, and his parents couldn't write. Now, I happen to come from a very literary family, but you don't have to come from a literary family to know that a pedigree that goes greatest writer in the world, illiterate, greatest writer in the world, illiterate. There's not a pedigree. That it's absolute nonsense. It just simply cannot happen. And to be able to write like Shakespeare, you really have to have been brought up at the table of people talking in a pretty elevated way, using an extremely rich vocabulary. You can't just be brought up at the table of someone who can't even write and therefore hasn't written any books. I mean, a lot of people try and accuse anti-Stratfordians, I'm sometimes called an anti-Stratfordian, of snobbery. And they say, oh, you're just a snob, you need Shakespeare to be someone grand, to satisfy your own ideas of what his biography should be like. I know huge numbers of anti-Stratfordians, and I say it's not true of a single one of them. We have, for instance, the example of Christopher Marlowe, who is a very great playwright as well, and he came from quite humble origins. His father was a cobbler. But the difference between Christopher Marlowe and William Shakespeare of Stratford is we have a clear evidence of his education. We know which school he went to. We know that he went to Cambridge University for 8 years. We know the scholars he mixed with. We know where he went, and we know his associations with court in various different places. So there's a huge difference, and nobody's ruling out William Shakespeare of Stratford on grounds of class. We're ruling him out because he could not have written the Shakespeare plays. It's as simple as that. All that we know about him points away from it, and everything that we know about William Shakespeare, the writer, points towards a pseudonym.
Well, isn't that an argument from silence? Even if we don't know where he was educated, there are many very brilliant people who are self-educated. Ramachandran, the mathematician, was from a very poor part of India, had no education, taught himself calculus, and was accepted into very prestigious Western schools with no high school degree. And so it doesn't seem too much of a stretch to think that there are people who are autodidacts and can teach themselves how to write, and that he just didn't care about legal documents, because I do the same thing. I just shorthand my name and don't care about them for legal documents as well. So it doesn't seem like too much of a stretch to think that he would have used a mark or shorthanded his name on legal documents, but was still able or capable of writing. So why would that not simply be an argument from silence, that because we don't have evidence of his education, therefore he didn't do it or something?
Well, I mean, you've just given me an argument from silence yourself. You gave me an example of someone who you said was an autodidact and was totally brilliant, and you obviously got the evidence for that somewhere. We do not have the evidence that William Shakespeare of Stratford was an autodidact. No one says it, and there's lots of people talking about William Shakespeare, the writer, and nobody says. Well, yet, whereas they do with Christopher Marlowe, they say, "Oh, he's a cobbler's son." Another writer who was a rope maker's son called Gabriel Harvey, and all the contemporaries are saying, you're just a rope maker's son. But nobody says, oh, you're William Shakespeare. I mean, he's just a wool dealer's son from the British Midlands. Nobody says that, and there's no evidence that he's an autodidact. And to be an autodidact in those days required quite a considerable amount of money. Books were very, very expensive. Public libraries didn't exist. In order to be an autodidact, you have to have a lot of great, expensive books at your disposal, which means either going into the house of a nobleman who has a huge library or into one of the libraries of the universities, but he didn't attend university. We have very good records of the two universities that existed at that time. That was Oxford and Cambridge, and William Shakespeare of Stratford did not go to any of them. Now, the other point is you say about evidence from absence of evidence, but the point is this: where people who are experienced and historians in this particular case, and they go looking for evidence and they do not find it. In those cases, whereas an experienced researcher cannot find evidence, then absence of evidence is material and it is interesting. And what I'm saying here is you have two things. Because if you're looking at all the contemporary evidence, you've got on the one hand the absence of evidence for William Shakespeare of Stratford, where you would expect to find it. And on the other hand, you've got a huge bundle of evidence pointing to him being a pseudonym. So, you just only need to put the two and two together and shed the emotional carapace, and one's there, bingo. And this is a fascinating world once you get into it and understand it. And it's not too difficult, but it does take a psychological jump that you're prepared to acknowledge that there is a problem. And the most extraordinary thing we have there are more books now written saying that William Shakespeare is a pseudonym than saying that it's not. And still we have the academies, the English literature professors, not professional historians, but English literature professors, who are going around saying there's no problem. And it's the most extraordinary thing that absolutely patently is a massive problem. And the more evidence we bring up, the more embarrassed they get, but they just still turn their backs and say there's no problem. I don't think this will be like this forever. I'm absolutely certain that the whole matter is going to be a sea change. I suspect after the death of Professor Sir Stanley Wells, who's well into his 80s now and seems to be the main old fogey holding the candle for the dreamers.
I'm still not seeing. I was muted. I was my.
I think you're. Yeah.
So there are many geniuses who had no education, and we have no evidence of them having an education because they didn't have one. Like Ramanujan is a great example. But when he was 12 years old, he had mathematical proofs, but we didn't know anything about him. We had no idea of his education whatsoever until he was then recognized and then sent to Harvard, where he could publish his things. And so the fact that there was no evidence of his education doesn't seem like it's a good reason to conclude he was unable to do these things. It's hard for me to grasp that as a strong argument against the case that the Shakespeare from Stratford was the author simply because he didn't have the education of another author that you're more plausibly would be able to write those things. It seems like
hang on. I'm not saying simply because that. This is one strand of argument, but I'm happy to continue talking with you about that one strand. It's not the defining definitive strand, but it's a strand. And I would contend with you that yes, it is important. And one of the reasons it's important is because you only have to look at the Shakespeare plays to understand the huge level of knowledge and reading that has gone into them. I have behind me in my library here 8 volumes of a man called Bullock who went through the sources of Shakespeare. And we're talking about he set stories that were only available in Italian, that had never been translated into English. He was clearly reading Italian books. He was reading French books. He was reading Latin and Greek sources. I mean, this is no ordinary education. We're talking about works of very, very high scholarship and very wide reading of expensive books. And to be very honest, to say that William Shakespeare of Stratford, who, by the way, left a will with not a single book in it, when books were very valuable things and you would normally leave them in your will or at least mention them, that no book has ever turned up that belonged to him, whose father and mother and children, as I say, could not write. And he's sitting there in the British Midlands, retiring from London stage, or so we're told, and going to live the life of sort of Rotarian burgher, that this man had read and assimilated all of these extraordinary erudite sources without a single person amongst the scholarly or literary community at the time recognizing him as a poet and scholar is beyond belief silly. I mean, we're getting into silly land, and I totally understand there are people out there who wish to hold on to this little Dick Whittington dream, but to hold on to it, you need something more solid than just, oh, well, maybe he didn't put books in his will because he forgot, or maybe they were on a separate piece of paper, or maybe. This is the evident arguing from absence of evidence, which is so prevalent on the Stratfordianist side and is not very prevalent on my side, where there's a hell of a lot of digging and a hell of a lot of evidence that's laid out in front of you to show you what really went on.
Well, to me, it seems like you are making the argument, well, if he was well educated and had books, or well educated enough to be able to read these books, then he would have done such and such in his will. But that seems to be the same kind of assumption making that the other side is saying, well, maybe he didn't, maybe he wasn't doing that. It seems like the case that we're both just hypothesizing about what this man would or wouldn't have done. But I don't see either of those as necessarily a strong case.
No, I mean, they're not particularly strong, but they're points, and they're points that all clamber up into a massive pile. Now, we do have a lot of people in those days, and many examples of people who left wills and put books in their will. Now, of course, I totally accept that William Shakespeare of Stratford, who apparently was William Shakespeare, the great writer, and read at least 500 very erudite books, either didn't have any books, or he'd borrowed them, or he just forgot to leave them in his will. Of course, that's a possibility. I'm not saying that's the nail that goes into the coffin that holds my case together, but it's just another strand that makes the more you look at this, the more obvious it becomes that we're dealing with a pseudonym. Actually, it's not a pseudonym; it's an allonym. So it's the name of, if you like, a real person, but is being used as the name on the cover of the plays. And by the way, this was a very common thing. I've got lots of examples of allonyms being used in those days.
Well, for me, like, my initial concern is that the cumulative case argument, that when you take a bunch of little pieces and you add them together, is something that's very common in arguments that aren't very strong. And so you have to take little tiny pieces from a lot of different places and try to put them together in such a way that it looks like a strong case. But given the diversity of human life, you can always find a contradictory set of things and group them together to portray a picture that may or may not be true. So, for example, if you were to go through all of my videos and find clips of me, you can find clips of me arguing that God exists, that the best argument for God is from a Hindu text, that I believe in deities, that I argue for the flat earth. You can find all kinds of clips of me. And if you got those and took them out of context, you could definitely build a case that I'm a theist. And so it seems like the ability to selectively choose things from the past and build a case to make it seem like some fact may be true, that fact may not represent the core identity of the individual. And so, for example, with the case of the master label, it would seem like if that was simply a coincidence, we would expect the master label to be applied like before and after this guy was given the title. But it seems like on his documents, he's only given that title as an author after this man was given that title and not before. So that's a strange coincidence that seems to go in the other direction.
Hang on. I've got to stop you there, because this man, as you call him, was never given that title. So that's wrong. The interesting thing about William Shakespeare of Stratford is no one ever in the course of his life, again, it's an evidence from absence argument, but nobody ever in his lifetime said that he was a writer. He never said he was a writer. His children never said he was a writer. Nobody associated with him ever claimed that he was a writer. It's all a posthumous bit of claim. Now, back to your main point that you just made. You're talking here about circumstantial evidence. And as you well know, if you go to a court of law, you can go to prison for a life sentence based on circumstantial evidence. And so you can't just dismiss circumstantial evidence as irrelevant, because circumstantial evidence, when it piles up in a certain way and cannot be refuted, is important evidence. And as I say, the case for William Shakespeare of Stratford being the author of these works is just as circumstantial as the case for anyone else being the author of those works. However, the great problem with the William Shakespeare of Stratford evidence is there's a tiny, weeny amount of it, and it's all posthumous, whereas the circumstantial evidence on the other side, there's a ruddy great mountain of it, and it's all contemporary. So, that's the way you've got to look at it. But I think just to dismiss circumstantial evidence as not worthy means that we wouldn't have proper historical investigations, and that would, to my mind, would be a great loss and a great shame. And history is a form of science in a way, and we need to challenge it and look at it and study it and evaluate evidence, not to say, oh, whoops, I haven't got anything but circumstantial, I might as well forget the whole thing.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I totally agree there. But I think that the question when analyzing historical figures is where the burden of proof lies. So like in the case of Jesus, Jesus mythicists say have lots of also circumstantial evidence to doubt the existence of Jesus. But if we start from the position that the burden of proof lies on those saying he did not exist, because in the historical records we tend to assume that accounts of people are true, and so there's lots of accounts of Jesus existing both in the New Testament documents as well as 6 or 7 extra biblical accounts, and in history that's enough. We're just like, all right, we probably just grant that he exists. But if you then say that the starting point is unfair because of some circumstantial evidence doesn't seem to be sufficient to be able to displace the burden of proof. You need something more than that, because if we accepted that this criterion, then it seems like we could doubt the existence of many, many historical figures that have even less evidence of their existence than Shakespeare does. So if we were to accept this set of criteria, don't you think we could essentially dismiss many more authors as being pseudonyms or fake or somebody else? And if so, do you think that this criterion is risky to adopt from a historical perspective?
Well, look, I take you to be a clever man, but I may have misunderstood the line of your questioning there, because it didn't seem to me remotely sensible, I'm afraid to say. And what you seem to be saying, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is that if history, whatever that might be, has established, whatever that might mean, a certain fact, and someone else comes along after the case and says, actually, this fact is wrong, then it is entirely up to the person who came along latterly to prove his case. And until you're satisfied that he's done that, you're going to stick with the original, however wrong and however silly that original might be. I mean, I am constantly saying to the Stratfordianists, come on, guys, wake up, pull up your sleeves and prove your ruddy case if you're so keen on it. I even went so far as to offer £40,000 to the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust to stand in front of a court of neutral judges and prove their case that William Shakespeare of Stratford was a writer, let alone the one who wrote Othello and Lear and Macbeth, just any writer, that he wrote a single poem. And of course, they wouldn't do that. And I offered this to the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust. They are a charitable or educational institution that is set up to further the cause of William Shakespeare of Stratford. And they would not take £40,000 to stand in front of a set of judges to make their case. So that's how weak it is. That's how bad it is. And what I'm up against is not people, like you're trying to do now, but trying to rationally unpick some of the things I'm suggesting. I'm not up against that. I'm up against people who are simply blocking their ears and running away in terror because they know they're wrong and their whole house is built on nothing but quicksand. And that's where we're at the moment. So until they can come out of their little hidey holes and either admit that they've got it wrong or properly defend, which I know they can't, because of course I know all the evidence for and against William Shakespeare of Stratford, and I wouldn't be sitting before you arguing about it if I thought they had a single point that's worth having in their case.
Well, £40,000, I could definitely get you some debates with professors. That's more than enough. I don't know about.
I've had a debate with a professor. You can watch that online if you want. I had a debate with Professor Sir Jonathan Bate, who's the Shakespeare professor at Oxford University. And if you can bear to sit through the long debate we had and watch the voting at the end, you'll see it was a public debate, and I completely crushed him. Because obviously all the evidence is on my side, and the poor fellow looked very, very withered at the end. But I take my hat off to him because he actually dared to come up and face some of these problems. Most of them won't do that. They literally hide and just say, he was William of Shakespeare, he was William of Stratford. That's not an argument. And their other argument is, oh, I'm just a snob, I'm a fool, I'm a tin hat conspiracy, all that sort of rubbish. So, the ad hominem doesn't work at all. And I just say, come on, let's look at the evidence here and stop being childish.
Yeah, but I do want to bring up what you said earlier. So my argument wasn't specifically that whoever brought it first automatically holds the truth. It's more that you're innocent until proven guilty. So in the case of history, innocence would be he exists until proven otherwise. And circumstantial evidence would not be enough to prove a person guilty. They're still innocent. You got to have more than circumstantial evidence. In
Yeah,
the
but
same case,
what's the crime? What's the crime? The crime in my book is having written plays and poems. That's the crime. Now, is William Shakespeare of Stratford guilty of that? Could
well, I
you
think
send him to court on that? That was how the court case I just talked to you about. That's how it was set up. So there were going to be a neutral panel of judges who were real legal judges, and there was an artificial idea of a crime. The crime is he wrote plays and poems, and he stands in the dock accused of writing plays and poems. So can the prosecution, i.e. the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust, convict this man of that crime?
well,
No.
the reason I bring this up is because I think that the innocent analogy for a court case in the case of history is exists. So he's a real person, not a pseudonym. That would be the innocent analogy. I think because of the methodology of history, we have to take he exists as a real person to be the starting point, the innocence position, and then to doubt him would be the he's guilty position where you need more than circumstantial evidence. And so even though both sides only have circumstantial evidence, because believing he exists as a real person and it's not a pseudonym is the default, that is a stronger position from a historical perspective because the methodology of history is such that it's more rational to believe those cases because they're mostly true. It's mostly the case that this was a real person and he really existed and it's not a lie, it's not a fabrication, it's not a myth. And because of that, I think that's the only real advantage that the position has. I think all of your arguments are perfectly rational, but I think that because of the methodology of history, it's better to take he exists as a real person to be the default position.
So if I were to find for you someone living in the middle of the 19th century by the name of George Eliot, who exists, you would say that it's perfectly natural to accept that George Eliot's novels are written by that man called George Eliot and are not a pseudonym for Mary Ann Evans.
I have no idea. I have no idea. I would need to, like, if that's the only information I had.
And as I said to you before, the absolute majority by miles of contemporary people talking about Shakespeare are hinting and nodding that it's a pseudonym. So I don't see how you can get away with creating a default position when I told you there were 8 people called William Shakespeare in England at that time anyway, and you've rather arbitrarily decided to have a default position for one of those 8 just because he existed. And I've told you, and I can find many examples of it, of writers using allonyms. They're putting other people's names. Thomas Nash was absolutely furious when someone put his name, Thomas Nash, on something that he didn't write. We have a letter sent from a man called Robert Beale asking if he can use someone's name on the front of something that isn't by him but is by the Earl of Essex. This was going on the whole time.
But just to jump in for a second there, which would be the first most rational thing to believe? So say we have a text written with a name and we have people around with that name and we know nothing else. There's no other information that we have. Is it more rational to believe that that person with the name wrote it or that it's a pseudonym? Well, I think that the default is probably that that person wrote it. And in order to get to the fact that it's a pseudonym, you need much more information.
Okay, let me take you back to the very first time the name William Shakespeare ever appeared on the front of anything. And that was on a poem called Venus and Adonis. And I'm going to try and address your question to what most rational people would have felt if they just picked up this poem, which says by William Shakespeare on it, and they had no idea of anything else. What would they actually have thought? Well, first thing they would have noticed was that the poem is dedicated to the Earl of Southampton. So the first thing you could say with certain certainty is that the person was known within aristocratic circles. The second thing you could say is that he wrote this poem based on...
Go back. So you said because it was dedicated to this man, he must have connections?
Intimately dedicated. Yes. And not just dedicated to an unknown person. He's talking about him in terms of friendship and acquaintance. There's no question of it. I don't think anyone would argue that. So he's known to the Earl of Southampton, who is a very high courtier. So therefore he's known in circles of nobility. Secondly, if anyone looked at the poem and they could see that it came from Ovid, and so that whoever wrote it was someone who knows a lot about the classics and is highly learned. So all we know so far is this person is a learned person who's got connections to the court, and therefore also, because he's had it published, which was quite difficult to do in those days, he's got literary connections and connections with the publishing literary world. Then you look at the name, William Shakespeare. Now, it's such a sad thing that nowadays we are just not nearly as educated as we should be, because we don't have all these classical references in our head. But what is the famous will that shakes a spear? It's the will of Pallas Minerva to the Romans, who is the patron goddess of playwrights and of eloquence, and all the poets in those days asked the patron goddess Pallas Minerva to help them write their plays. And Minerva famously shook her spear at Ilium and enabled thereby the what was he called? My brain's gone soggy. Hector to slay Achilles to slay Hector at Ilium. So you've got Ilium, Shakespeare. It's an absolute obvious allusion to Pallas Minerva, the patron goddess of playwrights. It's the most obvious pseudonym that you could possibly have for people in that age who were literary and classically trained. So that's my answer to you. They wouldn't think, oh no, this must be one of the 8 people I know. Could be that one up in Stratford-upon-Avon, or maybe it's the one that came from down London. Wasn't there one up in the north of England somewhere? I don't know. No, they wouldn't be thinking that. But they'd be straight onto it. They would know absolutely in an instant that it was a pseudonym, because, as I say, it was a very obvious one.
Just to clarify, wasn't the first work of Shakespeare the Richard III?
No, the first published work of Shakespeare with his name upon it was Venus and Adonis, published in 1593, though it is thought that some of the plays predate that. Sometimes some people give dates of 1588, 1589 for some of the plays, which were not published under the name Shakespeare. The first plays published under the name Shakespeare didn't happen until 1598 or so. My view of the whole matter is that they were written a hell of a lot earlier, and some of these plays were actually written in the 1570s and 80s and were greatly revised during the 1590s.
Gotcha. We have a few questions from the audience.
Yes.
Rudolph asked, if Shakespeare was a pseudonym, why do the vast majority of scholars believe it wasn't? They readily admit he didn't write everything in the plays, so they aren't protecting him.
Yeah. So the vast majority of scholars agree that it was a pseudonym, but not in the way I do. So what the vast majority of scholars say is there was a man called William Shakespeare, or they sometimes call him Shakespeare. Funny enough, in the 19th century and all before, he was always called Shakespeare, because that's how he actually wrote his name. But they say this man from Stratford-upon-Avon wrote these plays. They're beginning to say now the Oxford University has just brought out a huge new edition of Shakespeare, and they're saying that's actually written by lots of people, all chipping in. But then you get these funny plays. There's one called The London Prodigal. There's one called A Yorkshire Tragedy. And these are old quartos going back to the very beginning of the 17th century, which have by William Shakespeare on it. Now, every single scholar in the world accepts that those plays are not by William Shakespeare. So in those cases, they're saying, yes, Shakespeare's a pseudonym. But their argument for that is to say, oh, Shakespeare was so famous in those days that it was worth falsely putting out plays with his name on, because it would help sales. I find that a pretty weak argument, especially as both those plays were performed, the ones I've just mentioned, The London Prodigal and The Yorkshire Tragedy. They were both performed by the King's Men, and William Shakespeare of Stratford had connections to the King's Men and certainly would have put a stop to it if he was the writer, saying, I'm not having these plays that aren't jolly well by me being put out with my name on them, and there's no evidence that he did. I hope that answers the question, but do get back to me if you don't think it did.
Gotcha. Michael Warble asks, what was Joseph Conrad's English education level?
Well, a lot of people who are very, very good at English don't think he was that good at his English. Look, I'm coming straight out and telling you that I'm not a scholar of Joseph Conrad. I know, obviously, that he was Polish and he wrote all his books in English. I think if you're really good at English, you kind of sense that they're not quite up to it. But I'm not sure what the correlation is here, because we know a lot about Conrad. We know how he got to where he got. He was at Greenwich, I believe, working for ships, and so To my mind, I can't see, but maybe the person who's asked the question would like to clarify how that particular question connects to the Shakespeare authorship question. But
Gotcha. A question from Squid Super Hunk. He was asking, what was your criteria for determining whether or not they had convincing proof? He's referring to your debate challenge. Like you said, you were going to pay $40,000. But if you said you'd only pay them if they won the debate, which I think
yeah,
is what he's assuming,
yeah.
then you could have put like a ridiculous criteria in there or something.
No, the criteria was simply that the panel of neutral judges would find in favour of the prosecution, that's the Stratfordianists, and convict William Shakespeare of Stratford of having written plays and poems. That was the criteria. And these were neutral judges. They were to be people who didn't have a stake in the game, as it were, and they're just people whose whole careers have been spent assimilating evidence. And the question was, is there enough evidence to convict William Shakespeare of Stratford of that? But as I say, they ran a mile, and now it's being up to 100,000. So let's see what they do now.
Gotcha. Snake was right. Dude exists. His name is on plays and registries, but didn't actually write them because no, he's not credited with other works. I think that's a parody of your position, or supposed to be. So because the name is both on names and registries, plays and registries, it seems like he's arguing it's rational to conclude he existed.
Well, I don't know what registries he's talking about, unless he's talking about the stationer's register. Now, in those days, when you wanted to publish a book, you took it to the stationer's register, essentially to hold a sort of copyright over it. And what the stationer's register did was to copy out the information on the title page. So if you have information on the title page which says the tragic history of Richard III by William Shakespeare, then that would be copied from the title page into the stationer's register. So that's why you're getting that. It's just all they've done is just copy the title page, and there's no evidence at all. And to say the dude exists, again, this is, I think, how we started our whole discussion. I said, of course he exists. No one is denying that someone existed who wrote those plays. But what I'm trying to say is that it was a pseudonym, not that he didn't exist, that he was using a pseudonym. That's a very, very common thing. In fact, I read somewhere that someone searched and couldn't find a single writer of that period who hadn't used a pseudonym at one time or another. I mean, it's so
just to clarify, by exists here, he's just saying it's not a pseudonym. So he doesn't mean literally that you're arguing he did not exist. It's more just a shorthand to disagree with your position.
Oh, it's not a pseudonym because his name's on plays. Yeah, so I'll just give him another example. And we talked about George Orwell. So could I say about George Orwell, dude exists, has name on books and registries, is what this guy's just said. Does that mean that George Orwell is not a pseudonym? I mean, obviously it doesn't. So I'm sorry, that doesn't. Thanks for the question. I don't want to be rude to anyone. Thanks for the question, but it doesn't. It's not a very strong argument, really, frankly.
Seb Oz asked, who is represented in the painting of Shakespeare?
Which one is my answer? There are a number of paintings. Well, not paintings. I think probably the most famous image of Shakespeare comes from the first folio published in 1623, and that is an engraving by a man called Droeshout, Martin Droeshout. And everybody laughs at it and says what a ridiculous piece of art that is, because he appears to have a head floating way above his body. And by the way, this was at the time when there were extremely brilliant artists going around and engravers. And this was a very expensive book of 900 pages. And you've got this ludicrous thing that looks like someone wearing a mask with a bright piece of sun coming out of his forehead and sun rays coming out his side. And my argument is that we're looking at Phoebus Apollo. We're looking at Apollo with a mask over his face, which is the mask of a player. And William Shakespeare of Stratford was a player, another name for an actor. I think that may be the picture he's talking about. I don't know.
I don't know. I didn't know there were paintings of William Shakespeare.
There is no contemporary painting of William Shakespeare of Stratford. So after he dies in 1616, then the first folio comes out, this great book of plays, in 1623. That's 7 years later, and there's this mad, really jokey engraving that is not really of anybody. You only have to measure his head and see it doesn't work. And he's got his jacket on back to front.
Michael Warble brings up the same point that genius doesn't always require a formal education.
Well, it does in certain instances. Let me give you an instance, for instance. In Henry V, a whole scene is done in French. We've got Henry V talking in French in the French court. Come on, you can be as much a genius as you want, but you haven't learned how to speak French. You're not going to be able to write that scene, are you? And ditto, I don't quite understand how your just genius will enable you to write a whole story based on something that is only written in Latin or in Greek, ancient Greek, or in Italian. And we have Shakespeare taking stories from those three languages that were not at that time available in English. So it's no good just being a genius. Oh, it's fine. I'm a genius. I don't need to learn Italian and read that book. I'm just a genius. I'll just look at the cover and I'll guess what's in it because I'm a genius. I'm sorry, it doesn't work. You do need a level of education, and if you haven't got it, it looks bad. Again, I would say this is the sort of argument that, that you're talking about absence arguments. I mean, that is the Stratfordian line. Oh, well, he's a genius, so forget it. Down tools, forget all the evidence you've assembled, all the books you've written, all you've thought about, because he was a genius. That answers it. Well, no, thanks.
James Earl asks, could they do like a cursive analysis of the writing of Shakespeare and the William Shakespeare of Stratford to compare, and has that been done to be able to make a correlation that he was or was not the same person?
So from the hand of William Shakespeare of Stratford, we have absolutely nothing except these 6 signatures. And these are highly contentious. And a person called Jane Cox, who was keeper of the manuscripts in the British Museum, published it and put it on record that in her opinion, all of these 6 signatures were written in different hands. So now what have we got? We've got 6 signatures, all written in different hands, and some of them, as I've already told you, were abbreviated to Will Shack P. So we don't even have a full list of alphabet letters to start comparing it with. And before we've even got to that stage, there's an argument about whether William Shakespeare of Stratford actually made those signatures, which I don't think he did. So we don't actually have, unfortunately, any manuscript of the plays or the poems. Not a single shred of it exists. That's all disappeared. We only have printed copies. So unfortunately, that test, which would be great if we could do it, is not possible to do. Lack of evidence.
He also asked, when will the next great Shakespeare occur?
Possibly never. I mean, it could happen. You have to look at what Shakespeare was trying to do. And I think we have to get out of our heads the idea that William Shakespeare was just an amazingly brilliant man who just wanted to put on a play to entertain people. I don't think that's the case. I think William Shakespeare was running a scriptorium. In that scriptorium, he had up to 12 scholars and poets with him, opening up books. And I know this happens a bit in Hollywood, and Hollywood plays are often quite bad when Hollywood films, when they're written by a sort of committee or consensus. Try and look at it as though, I don't know if you know much about the art of the Renaissance, Titian and the great painters of that period, they had a studio, and Titian, the great artist, would decide what the subject of the painting was going to be, what the theme of the painting, what the symbolism of the painting was going to be. And he had young apprentices who sometimes did the grass and the togas around, and some of those went on to become great painters in their own right later. And this, we know, this was sponsored by the Crown in the case of Shakespeare. So, and one of the purposes of it was to elevate the education, the soul, the mind of the British people, English people. And so when will the next great Shakespeare occur? I think you would have to start with all of that premise that you've actually got a team of people led by an extremely brilliant person whose wish and purpose is to elevate the soul of mankind through scholarship, education, etc., etc. So in the present situation, we're not going to have another Shakespeare, guaranteed.
Gotcha. Udolph asked, the Beatles had a song in French but don't speak French. They had a friend who translated it. Would it be possible that Shakespeare could have had someone who was educated who knew Latin? Because you mentioned, since he did write his first book, he was very well connected, that his connections could also have a translator for him, and he didn't write these directly in these other languages.
Again, I'm not saying that's impossible, but there's absolutely no record that French scholars or French speakers or Italian scholars or Italian speakers sat around with Shakespeare translating all these things. It would be a highly inconvenient way of doing it, to take whole Italian books and say to Shakespeare, oh, there's this story here from this Italian book, might make a good play. Oh, right, will you translate it all for me first? This guy's supposedly a jobbing actor running a sort of not very well paying farm in the British Midlands. I mean, is he really hanging around with all these people? Wouldn't it be more convenient to actually have a playwright who read these things, who loved them, who saw the purpose of it and went straight to the heart of it and understood how to turn this into a play, rather than have to go have this actor being read to and translated for? Seems very, very rum to me.
That goes into the next question, actually. Chemo asks, written works get interpreted and spread by word of mouth in all cultures. It's not improbable that Elizabethan English fellow would have known the Bacchiacco tales and other popular stories, and so he could have heard it through it being told word of mouth, and that could have made him equally as inspired without actually having someone translate it and write it down for him.
Well, unfortunately, we know that he looked at the actual text. So, you have actual parts in the plays that correspond identically to sentences in Italian, in some of these Italian plays, and Bandello and other people. So, no, so we know, and I think there's no dispute among the scholarly fraternity that he actually knew these works and knew particular sentences of them. So just a sort of recap of the overall story would not have sufficed to write the plays in the way he did. I'm talking about the ones that were taken from foreign language sources.
Peter asks, Ben Jonson wrote that the engraving was a good likeness of his friend Shakespeare.
Well, Ben Jonson actually said, look not on this picture, read his book. Now, I don't know how you interpret that, but to me, it's saying the picture's not doing the job, read the book. There's something a bit wrong about the picture. So he didn't say good likeness. And I see that the questioner there, Peter, went, and with no disrespect to you, Peter, we've done something a little bit naughty. You've got to put quotation marks around good likeness, as though Ben Jonson used the words good likeness. He didn't, and I suspect you know that. So you must ask the question again and take those quotation marks out of it. And as I say, you get the answer that Ben Jonson said, look not on this picture, but on the book.
All right, and last question from James Earl. Who do you think has come closest to being as literarily proficient as Shakespeare?
I think Shakespeare stands a good head and shoulders like a colossus above pretty well anyone else, but then again, as I say, I think it was a sort of team effort, but it was a very brilliant team, and then there was a lot of mending and correcting afterwards. So it was a very interesting process that happened. I'm not a huge student of all the great writers in the world. I am a huge student of my own grandfather, because I'm actually currently editing 43-volume scholarly edition of his complete works for the Oxford University Press. And he was Evelyn Waugh. Some of your listeners might not know who he was, but he wrote a lot of novels, most famous perhaps being Brideshead Revisited, but lots of other ones. And he, because I know so much about him and his techniques and so much about Shakespeare and his, I find it quite easy to spot the similarities. And the similarities are a great love of language. I mean, absolute worship of language as this very, very powerful tool. It's also the ability to see real life, people yourself, and put them through a kaleidoscope and turn them into fictional characters, so that you're not really inventing that much, but what you're doing is reassembling from your own experience and your own life. These were very, very similar, but the great difference, of course, was that William Shakespeare was a poet and Evelyn Waugh was a novelist. But you see in both how genius works and how it assembles great works of art. But I'm not saying that Evelyn Waugh's on the level of William Shakespeare, but I'm just saying I do appreciate and understand a great lot of parallels and similarities between those two writers over the centuries apart.
Awesome. Thanks. We've been going for a little over an hour. I really appreciate you coming on. It was a great conversation. Do you want to give any links or references where people can find more about your work?
Because we started off the conversation about cryptology, which I did say to you is not my biggest thing, but I am very, very excited and proud of one bit of cryptology. I would love the curious listener to this to visit my YouTube channel, which is just called Alexander Waugh. and there you will find a YouTube video called The Incalculable Genius of John Dee. And John Dee was the sort of wizard, mathematician, clever clogs around the court of Queen Elizabeth. And in that, I show, in the simplest way I know how, this unbelievable decryption of how we know where he was buried. And of course, there we haven't mentioned on this who I think Shakespeare is, but I'll leave it to anyone who watches that, and it gives one fantastic proof, I would say, of the fact that I'm right. And then if you explore that a channel, I've got a whole playlist, a whole series of ones called Who Knew, and I take different people. A lot of them you won't have heard of. Ben Jonson's obviously quite famous, but a lot of them they'll be meaningless names to you. But you know, John Cook knew, so and so knew, and in each of those, I take a contemporary of William Shakespeare and show the evidence that that contemporary knew that William Shakespeare was a pseudonym, and they knew who was using that pseudonym. And they're just quite fun to explore those. You only need to get through 2 or 3, and you'll be convinced. But you know, you can go through the whole lot and just have fun with it. It's terrific fun. That's the main point.
Yeah. Peter wanted to jump in last. He said the actual quote says "hit his face," indicating that Droshout, the artist, had captured Shakespeare accurately.
No, I'm very sorry. You've got to read the sentence properly. He says, if the graver had hit his face as well as such and such, I haven't got it in front of me, that it's an if clause. It's not saying he brilliantly hit his face, and he certainly didn't say that it was a brilliant, perfect likeness. I mean, you're pushing meaning a bit hard there, I think. But anyway,
Gotcha.
Thank you for coming back.
Absolutely. Thanks for coming on. Really appreciate it. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you very much. It was an honor and a joy, and good luck with all your programs and machinations and whatever you're up to.
Thank you.
Bye.
Talk to you later.